Welcome to the Chapter 13 lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about how the skills in Chapter 13 fit into typical academic situations. And then we'll look at how to use sources ethically and how some people get into trouble using sources. This chapter looks quite a bit at paraphrasing. And a question you might be asking yourself is, when might you want to use a paraphrase? Strict paraphrases are somewhat rare in academic writing. Mostly, if a writer isn't going to summarize, then they'll go ahead and quote the original exactly using quotation marks. That's because they want to preserve as much of the original writing, the original author's intention as possible. Some exceptions are if the original work is written in informal English or in an English dialect. Then the secondary author might paraphrase the original in order to translate it into a more formal standard English style so that the tone fits better with the article or essay that they're writing. Similarly, if for some reason you need to make use of a source that's badly written, let's say an internet blog post or something like that, you might paraphrase it so that the errors don't distract from the ideas, like here. You may notice that this is sort of what's going on with the quitting hip-hop article that's being paraphrased in the exercises in Chapter 13. The author of this article uses some language from hip-hop culture, and so the paraphraser rewrites it in academic style language, as you can see in this example here. Also, students sometimes paraphrase difficult works for their own understanding. I do this if I'm reading a very difficult text. I'll paraphrase it sentence by sentence so that I can aid my own comprehension of the work. I'll show you an example. I'm currently reading this book, Language and Symbolic Culture by Pierre Bourdieu, and it is extremely difficult. This is what my own paraphrase looks like. And I have pages and pages and pages of it. And I haven't even gotten that far in the book yet. So it can be a really useful tool if you find yourself confronting a very difficult text using the paraphrase method. Notice that in your book, every single sentence paraphrased begins with the author's name. Davis says this, Davis observes that. You can see that here. Davis observes, Davis argues, Davis reports. With paraphrasing, you have to go above and beyond so that the reader knows that these are not your words or not your idea. If you give the impression that these thoughts are coming from you and not the original author, then that is plagiarism. That's why the author in your textbook uses Davis says, Davis argues, according to Davis, over and over and over. Let's talk about how we define plagiarism. Plagiarism is a catch-all term that includes any use of another's words, ideas, or even idea structure without giving the original author credit in exactly the right way. In the business world, in politics, in daily life, we all do this to some extent. Maybe we say, I heard somewhere that X, Y, and Z. Or a politician gives a speech and never actually credits the person who wrote the speech, the speechwriter. In academia, though, we're very, very strict about giving credit in exactly the right way. We call it documenting the sources that we use. So, restating someone else's ideas in your own words, you have to give credit to them by naming them in the sentence, like we see in the exercises in your book, or by using an in-text citation, which we won't be covering in class, in this particular class, but if you'd like to learn about it, you can read about it in Chapter 14, and you'll certainly deal with it in your upcoming writing courses. Paraphrasing without changing enough of the words can also be considered plagiarism, like on page 311 and 312, where the textbook breaks the sentence into chunks and makes them different colors. If the writer had left some of those 3- and 4-word phrases unchanged in the paragraph or in the paraphrase, then that would be considered plagiarism because the reader thinks that the words are your own, but they aren't. Similarly, in a summary, You must be certain to credit the author you're summarizing and use only your own words in the summary. Occasionally, you'll have to use a single term from the original, like if the paragraph is about cats, then you don't have to say felines, but avoid any string of 3 or more words in a row that are exactly like the original. 3 or more words in a row is a good rule of thumb to use to make sure that you're not paraphrasing too closely. Let's talk about a few more common situations of plagiarism. The obvious one is just cutting and pasting entire paragraphs from the internet or some other source. Obviously, that's not just accidental citing, that one's clearly dishonest. Similarly, buying a paper or having someone else write a paper for you, clearly dishonest and unacceptable in academic situations. If you read an article and then write a paper that makes the exact same argument as that article with nothing unchanged, even if you do it in your own words, but you don't add any of your own ideas and you don't credit the original, that's plagiarism and also dishonest. Also, even if you did credit the original, but your essay didn't add anything of your own, anything new to the first writer's ideas, your professor probably won't be real happy with you, because we want to see evidence of your thought, your original ideas in any work that you submit to us. If you use a piece of information that you didn't personally do a survey of or discover the information for, then you have to give credit to the person who did. Like, let's say you read somewhere that 15% of high school students regularly arrive tardy to class or something like that. Unless you're the one that surveyed those high school students to figure that out, then you have to cite the survey they did. One exception to this is if the piece of data is so widely known that multiple sources use it without crediting anyone. For example, the information, let's say that the Battle of Gettysburg was fought on July 1, 2, and 3 in 1863. It's not like everyone has that memorized, but it's very common information. Many history books, many sources online, and so on. So you don't need to cite that. But when you're in doubt about a piece of information, go ahead and cite it. If you use someone else's pictures, diagrams, charts, or other information, or other visual information, you need to credit the original author. Here's a tricky one. If you reuse something that you've previously written for another class and submitted to another professor, you must cite it as your own work. Suppose you excerpt a paragraph from something that you've previously written and want to include it in a future work. You have to treat it like an outside source, put it in quotation marks, and cite that original source, even if it's yourself. And if you want to turn in an entire essay that you've written for one class, turn it into another class, you need to get permission from the professor to do that. It is considered academically dishonest to double dip and turn in the same essay for more than one class unless you get permission. Now, for this class, you'll not be required or expected to do any research at all whatsoever for your essay. So you shouldn't have to worry about the issue of citing things incorrectly. But we should talk about academic consequences for plagiarism nevertheless. At NNU, like most universities, we take academic honesty very, very seriously. A breach of academic honesty is going to have serious academic consequences, anything from a lowered grade to expulsion, depending on the offense. Now, professors are given a lot of freedom to decide what penalties they'll impose for academic dishonesty, but these are the ones that are pretty typical. For the most time, if it looks like an honest mistake, an accident, say, the professor will penalize maybe 10, 20, 30% of the paper's grade. But if it's obvious dishonesty, a paper cribbed from the internet, let's say, then usually they'll receive a 0, possibly even failure of the course, again, depending on the professor's discretion. All academic honesty gets reported to the dean, the vice president for academic affairs, and the student's advisor. If the student is involved in sports, sometimes the coach is notified as well. Usually for a first offense, the university won't take further action beyond what the professor decides, But if the student has done something similar in another class, the university might impose further penalties, like the loss of financial aid, academic probation, or expulsion. If you have questions about this lecture, or later, if you have a question as we begin writing essays in this class, please don't hesitate to ask me. I won't ever be upset that you asked a question about plagiarism. It's much better to ask before turning something in than to suffer the consequences later. In other writing courses that you take at NNU, you'll hear this same message from other professors as well. Soon, it won't be long before you're doing citation quickly and easily with all the research essays that you do.